Dessel was lost in the suffering of his job, barely even aware of his surroundings. His arms ached from the endless pounding of the hydraulic jack. Small bits of rock skipped off the cavern wall as he bored through, ricocheting off his protective goggles and stinging his exposed face and hands. Clouds of atomized dust filled the air, obscuring his vision, and the screeching whine of the jack filled the cavern, drowning out all other sounds as it burrowed centimeter by agonizing centimeter into the thick vein of cortosis woven into the rock before him. Impervious to both heat and energy, cortosis was prized in the construction of armor and shielding both commercial and military interests, especially with the galaxy at war. Highly resistant to blaster bolts, cortosis alloys supposedly could withstand even the blade of a lightsaber. Unfortunately, the very properties that made it so valuable also made it extremely difficult to mine. Plasma torches were virtually useless. It could take days to burn even away a small section of cortosis-laced rock. The only effective way to mine it was through the brute force of hydraulic jacks pounding relentlessly away at a vein, chipping the cortices free bit by bit. Cortosis was one of the hardest materials in the galaxy. The force of pounding quickly wore down the head of the jack, blunting it until it became almost useless. The dust clogged the hydraulic pistons, making them jam. Mining cortosis was hard on the equipment, and even harder on the miners. Des had been hammering away for nearly 6 standard hours. The jack weighed more than 30 kilos, and the strain of keeping it raised and pressed against the rock face were taking its toll. His arms were trembling from the exertion. His lungs were gasping for air and choking on the clouds of fine mineral dust thrown up from Jack's head. Even his teeth hurt. The rattling vibration felt as if were shaking him loose from his gums. But the miners on Apatros were paid based on how much cortosis they brought back. If he quit now, another miner would jump in and start working the vein, taking a share of his profits. Des didn't like to share. The whine of the jack's motor took on a higher pitch, becoming a keening wail Des was all too familiar with. At 20,000 RPMs, the motor sucked in dust like a thirsty bantha sucking up water after a long desert crossing. The only way to combat it was regular cleaning and servicing. In the Outer Rim, Oreworks Company preferred to buy cheap equipment and replace it rather than sinking credits into maintenance. Des knew exactly what was going to happen. Next, and a second later, it did. The motor blew. The hydraulic seized with a terrible crunch, and a cloud came back. Black smoke spit out the rear of the jack. Cursing ORO and its corporate policies, Des released his cramped finger from the trigger and tossed the spent piece of equipment to the floor. "Move aside," a voice said. Gerd, one of the other miners, stepped up and tried to shoulder Des out of the way so he could work the vein with his own jack. Gerd had been working the mines for nearly 20 standard years and had turned his body into a massive, hard, knotted muscle. But Des had been working the mines for 10 years himself, ever since he was a teenager, and he was just as solid as the older man, and a little bigger. He didn't budge. "I'm not done here," he said. "Jack died, that's all. Hand me yours and I'll keep at it for a while." "You know the rules, kid. You stop working with someone, and someone else is allowed to move in." Technically, Gerd was right, but nobody ever jumped in on another miner's claim over an equipment malfunction, not unless he was trying to pick a fight. Des took a quick look around. The chamber was empty except for the two of them, standing less than a half a meter apart. Not a surprise. Des usually chose caverns far off the main tunnel network. It had to be more than mere coincidence that Gerd was here. Des had known Gerd for as long as he could remember. The middle-aged man had been friends with Hurst, Des's father. Back when Des first started working the mines, at 13, he had taken a lot of abuse from the bigger miners. His father had been the worst tormentor, but Gerd had been one of the main instigators, dishing out more than his fair share of teasing, insults, and occasional cuff on the ear. Their harassments had ended shortly after Dez's father died of a massive heart attack. It wasn't because the miners felt sorry for the orphaned young man, though. By the time Hearst died, the tall, skinny teenager they loved to bully had become a mound of muscle with heavy hands and a fierce temper. Mining was a tough job. It was the closest thing to hard labor outside a Republic prison colony. Whoever worked the mines on Apatros got big, and Dez just happened to become the biggest of them all. Half a dozen black eyes, countless bloody noses, and one broken jaw in the space of a month was all it took for Hearst's old friends to decide they'd be happier if they left Dez alone. Yet it was almost as if they blamed him for Hearst's death, and even a few months, one of them tried again. Gert had always been smart enough to keep his distance, until now. "I don't see any of your old friends here with you, old man," Dez said. "So back off my claim and nobody gets hurt." Gert spat on the ground at Dez's feet. "You don't even know what day it is, do you, boy? Criffy disgrace. What you are." They were standing close enough to each other that Dez could smell the sour Corellian whiskey on Gert's breath. The man was drunk enough to come looking for a fight, but still sober enough to hold his own. 5 years ago today," Gert said, shaking his head sadly. 5 years ago today, your own father died, and you don't even remember." Dez rarely even thought about his father anymore. He hadn't been sorry to see him go. His earliest memories were of his father were them smacking him. He didn't even remember the reason. Hearst rarely needed one. "Can't say I miss Hearst the same way you do, Gerd." "Hearst? He raised you by himself after your mama died, and you don't even have the respect to call him Dad. You ungrateful son of a calf hound." Dez glared down at him menacingly at Gerd, but the shorter man was too full of drink and self-righteous indignation to be intimidated. "Should have expected this from a mudcrotch whelp like you," Gerd continued. Hearst always said you were no good. He knew there was something wrong with you, Bane." Dez narrowed his eyes, but didn't rise to the bait. Hearst had called him by that name when he was drunk. Bane. He had blamed his son for his wife's death, blamed him for being stuck on a Patros. He considered his only child to be the bane of his existence, a fact that he tended to spit out at Dez in his drunken rages. Bane. It represented everything spiteful, petty, and mean about his father. It struck at the innermost fears of every child. Fear of disappointment, fear of abandonment, fear of violence. As a kid, that name had hurt more than all the smacks from his father's heavy fists. But Dez wasn't a kid anymore. Over time, he learned to ignore it, along with all the rest of the hateful bile that spilled from his father's mouth. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. "I've got work to do." With one hand, he grabbed the hydraulic jack from Gerd's grasp. He put the other hand on Gerd's shoulder and shoved him away. Stumbling back, the inebriated man caught his heel on a rock and fell roughly to the ground. He stood up with a snarl, his hands bailing into fists. "Guess your daddy's been gone too long, boy. You need someone to beat the sense back into you." Gerd was drunk, but he was no fool, Dez realized. Dez was bigger, stronger, younger, but he'd spent the last 6 hours working hydraulic jack. He was covered in grime and sweat, dripped off his face. His shirt was drenched. Gerd's uniform, on the other hand, was relatively clean. No dust, no sweat stains. He must have been planning this all day, taking it easy and sitting back while Dez wore himself out. But Dez wasn't about to back down from a fight. Throwing Gerd's jack to the ground, he dropped into a crouch, feet wide, and arms held out in front of him. Gerd charged toward him, swinging his right fist in vicious uppercut. Dez reached out and caught the punch with the open palm of his left hand, absorbing the force of the blow. His right hand snapped and grabbed the underside of Gerd's right wrist. As he pulled the older man forward, Dez ducked down and turned, driving his shoulder into Gerd's chest, using his own opponent's momentum against him. Dez straightened up and yanked hard on Gerd's wrist, flipping him up and over so he crashed to the ground on his back. The fight should have ended right then. Des had a split second where he could have dropped to his knee onto his opponent, driving the breath right from his lungs and pinning him to the ground while he pounded Gerd with his fists. But it didn't happen. His back, exhausted from hours of hefting and 30-kilo jack, spasmed. The pain was agonizing. Instinctively, Des straightened up, clutching at the knotted lumbar muscles. It gave Gerd a chance to roll out of the way and get back to his feet. Somehow, Des managed to drop into his fighting crouch again. His back howled in protest, and he grimaced as his red-hot daggers of pain shot through his body. Gerd saw the grimace and laughed. "Cramping up there, boy? Should know better than to try and fight after a 6-hour shift in the mines." Gerd charged forward. This time his hands weren't fists, but claws, grasping and grabbing at anything they could find, trying to nullify the younger man's height and reach by getting in close. Des tried to scramble out of the way, but his legs were too stiff and sore to get him clear. One hand grabbed his shirt, the other got hold of his belly, as Gerd pulled on both of them to the ground. He's stealing an apple. It's okay. They grappled together, wrestling on a hard, uneven stone on the cavern floor. Gerd had his face buried against Des's chest to protect it. Keeping Des from landing on a solid elbow or headbutt, he still had a grip on Des's belt. But now his other hand was free and punching blindly up to where he guessed Des's face would be. Des was forced to wrap his arms in and around Gerd's own, interlocking them so neither man could throw a punch. With their limbs pinned, strategy and technique meant little. The fight had become a test of strength and endurance, with two combatants slowly wearing each other down. Dessel tried to roll Gerd onto his back, but his weary body betrayed him. His limbs were heavy and soft. He couldn't get the leverage he needed. Instead, it was Gerd who was able to twist and turn, wrenching one of his hands free while still keeping his face pressed tight against Des's chest so it wouldn't be exposed. Des wasn't so lucky. His face was open and vulnerable. Gerd struck a blow with his free hand, but he didn't hit with a closed fist. Instead, it drove his thumb into Des's cheek, only a few centimeters from his real target. He struck again with the thumb, looking to gouge out one of his opponent's eyes and leave him blind and writhing in pain. It took Des a second to realize what was happening. His tired mind had become as slow as clumsy as his body. He turned his face away just as the second blow landed. The thumb jammed painfully into the cartilage of his upper ear. Dark rage exploded in Des. A burst of fury, passion burned away the exhaustion and fatigue. Suddenly his mind was clear, and his body felt strong and rejuvenated. He knew what it was going to do next. More importantly, he knew with absolute certainty what Gerd would do next too. He couldn't explain how he knew. Sometimes he could just anticipate an opponent's next move. Instinct, some might have said. Des felt it was something more. It was too detailed, too specific to be simple instinct. It was more like a vision, a brief glimpse into the future. And whenever it happened, Des always knew what to do, as it was something guiding and directing his actions. When the next blow came, Des was more ready for it. He could picture it perfectly in his mind. He knew exactly when it was coming and precisely where to strike. This time he turned his head in the opposite direction, exposing his face to the incoming blow and opening his mouth. He bit down hard. His timing was perfect, and his teeth sank deep into the dirty flesh of Gerd's throbbing thumb. Gerd screamed as Des clamped his jaw shut, severing his tendons and striking bone. He wondered if he could bite clean through, and then as if the very thought made it happen, he severed Gerd's thumb. The screams became shrieks as Gerd released his grasp and rolled away, clasping his maimed hand with his whole one. Crimson blood welled up through his fingers, trying to staunch the flow with his stump. Standing up slowly, Des spat the thumb onto the ground. The taste of blood was hot in his mouth. His body felt strong and re-energized, as if some great power surged through his veins. All the fight had been taken out of his opponent. Des could do anything he wanted to Gerd now. The older man rolled back and forth on the floor, his hand clutched to his chest. He was moaning and sobbing, begging for mercy, pleading for help. Des shook his head in disgust. Gerd had brought this upon himself. It had started as a simple fist fight, the loser would have ended up with a black eye and some bruises, but nothing more. Then the older man had taken things to another level by trying to blind him, and he'd responded in kind. Des had learned long ago not to escalate a fight unless he was willing to pay the price of losing. Now, Gerd had learned that lesson too. Des had a temper, but he wasn't the kind of to keep beating on a helpless opponent. Without looking back at his defeated foe, he left the cavern and headed back up the tunnel to tell one of the foremen what had happened so someone could come tend to Gerd's injury. He wasn't worried about the consequences. The medics could reattach Gerd's thumb, so at worst, Dad would be fined a day or two's wages. The corporation didn't really care what its employees did, as long as they kept coming back to the mine. The cortosis. Fights were common among the miners, and ORO almost always turned a blind eye, though this particular fight had been more vicious than most, savage and short, with a brutal end, just like life on Patros.